All right, crim 28. Let's knock out chapter 13. Juvenile justice, probation, and parole. So, as I've told you all about a million times, probably too many times, the vast majority of my career was working within the juvenile justice field. So I did work most of my career in juvenile probation. So a lot of this stuff is pretty familiar for me, and I really enjoyed working with youth. I'm not exactly sure why, but that was kind of, I got lucky and I was able to stay there throughout most of my career, and that was where I wanted to be, and it was definitely challenging, but it was the right place for me. But anyways, although the rate of juvenile crime has declined over the past, I don't know, at least decade, juvenile arrests account for 17% of all violent crimes in the United States and 26% of property crimes. So still, they account for a significant number. A quarter of all property crimes, that's still a pretty high number. So, based on the concept of parens patriae, as some of us have if you've had me before for juvenile delinquency, probably intro to corrections, we've talked about this before. The concept of parens patriae was always to take care of the youth. Basically, it was a concept that was brought over from England, where the King of England would basically step in and act as the parent of the child who wasn't being taken care of properly in his mind by the parents. So ultimately, that's what we're doing here in the United States now. If a child is in a juvenile delinquency or dependency court, a lot of times the court will step in and act as the parent. And a lot of you will remember, my easy way to remember this was the court is your daddy. So the court would step in and make decisions on behalf of the child when the parents weren't taking care of business. So in some ways, when we're dealing with juveniles, we want to protect the juveniles and we want to make decisions that best suit the child. But in other ways, we want to make sure that the children or juveniles are being held accountable for their behavior. So it's always kind of a tough mix here to try and figure out the best way to care for the child, but make sure that they're being held accountable for their behavior as well. So there are differences and similarities in the adult and juvenile system. A lot of it has to do with just the terminology, that we just use different words. The terms have minimal impact on the process. So when you look at the processes between the juvenile and adult system, they are very similar. However, the differences that are there can make the entire process significantly different. I know I'm totally talking in circles when I say this, but there are some things like sentencing and disposition. Those two words basically mean the same thing. Sentencing is an adult court, disposition is juvenile court. Is the concept of sentencing the same as it is in adult court and juvenile court? Not necessarily. If you're sentencing an adult offender in adult court, you're going to be thinking a lot more about punishment than you would be if you were talking about a juvenile. When you are sentencing a juvenile at their disposition hearing, you're trying to rehabilitate that offender, always, in juvenile court. When you're sentencing an adult, that's not necessarily always going to be the number one idea, concept. So there are differences and similarities, but here are some of the big differences. The judge in the juvenile court definitely has a more hands-on, active role in what's going to happen to the juvenile. Now, honestly, in my opinion, probation actually has a lot more active role in the juvenile courts. If you are being sentenced in a juvenile court, there's very likely a juvenile probation officer sitting in that courtroom at the counsel table. You have a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and a probation officer sitting there arguing the case, which is actually true in the adult courts as well. Juvenile court judges and probation officers, these are the intake officers, have a lot of discretion also in juvenile cases as to whether the charges are ever even filed in a juvenile case. So there's a lot more discretion involved, and punishment is significantly less severe in a juvenile case. A person could be charged with a 10-year felony in a juvenile case, and they could get a year in juvenile hall. And that would be a long sentence. It's not going to happen in the adult world. It's a different concept, different idea, and the punishment is definitely significantly less severe. The jurisdiction does vary from state to state. In California, there is no minimum age. So here your book says 10, but we're not necessarily talking about California. In California, a child has to know the difference between right and wrong. So are there a lot of kids younger than 10 that know the difference between right and wrong as far as a court is concerned? You know, it just depends. But there is no actual hard age in California for minimum, but the maximum age is 17 in California. So the day you turn 18, you are no longer a juvenile. They have two types of, they say acts committed, but if you are a juvenile in juvenile delinquency court, you have committed a criminal act. We don't have these types of criminal conduct in need of supervision acts in juvenile courts in California. These are things like being out past curfew, stuff like that, what we would call status offenses. Oh, I already did that. Waiver to adult court. This is something in California that we call a fitness hearing. So what can happen is if a juvenile, a person under the age of 18 in California, commits what we call a strikeable offense. It's also known as a Welfare and Institutions Code Section 707B offense. These are serious violent felonies. Then that juvenile could be eligible to go to adult court. By way of a judicial waiver, the judge has the ability to transfer that case, or concurrent jurisdiction, meaning that it could be shared by both the juvenile and adult courts. Now in California, typically the case would start in the juvenile court, not always, but typically it would start in the juvenile court, and then the juvenile court would find the offender unfit for juvenile court and send it to adult court, which is why in California we call it a fitness hearing as opposed to a waiver. But most states do call it a waiver. California, we just, of course, you know California. We do things all kinds of interesting ways. Statutory exclusion. Sometimes a DA's office will file the charges directly, with what we call in California a direct file. They'll file it directly into adult court because the case was so heinous. Doesn't happen very often, but that can happen in California. Once the juvenile court in California has decided that the offender is unfit for juvenile court, that offender becomes an adult for purposes of the trial and sentence. So, I had a case, a young man who was 17 at the time, who shot and killed his mother's pimp. It was really sad. The mom's pimp had beaten her up many times before, but on this day, the pimp was just walking up to the front door of the house with no weapon, not threatening. He was just walking up to the front of the house. The young man, who was 17 at the time, saw the pimp walking up to the front door, grabbed a shotgun, opened the front door, and blew the pimp away in the front yard of the house. Now, we all can probably understand why the young man shot the pimp in the front yard of the house. But because the mother was not at imminent risk, she was not immediately in danger, it doesn't really matter. He was still charged with murder, probably a second-degree murder or manslaughter, something like that. because the nature of the offense was so egregious, it was so serious, he ended up ultimately going into he was found unfit for juvenile court, and he was sent off to the adult courts and was sent to prison as a result. I know it was really sad. I felt bad for him, but obviously, because it was so severe, I don't think he had a juvenile record. I don't think we'd ever tried to work with him before. He probably wasn't that much of a danger to the community because he obviously killed mom's pimp. He was just trying to protect his mother, but that particular offense was so serious that the courts just really couldn't look the other way and give him a pass. Well, not a pass, but couldn't keep him in the juvenile world. This is kind of a chart that shows you, it kind of starts over here. We'll say this is 100% of cases, of intake cases for juveniles that come into intake. Intake is typically probation. They'll get the police reports that occur with the under 18ers. And you can see that 56% of them are petitioned, meaning they actually go to the DA's office for filing. And 44% of them are either go this way. Sorry, someone's yelling in my house right now. Not in a bad way. They're just, somebody's goofing around. They're either diverted, or dismissed. These are actually sent to the DA's office. Some of these are sent to the adult world. These are adjudicated, meaning they go to court and they are actually adjudged delinquents or sentenced. And these are all handled either informally or they are dismissed. So, adjudication means trial. So these are pre-trial procedures. Adjudication means trial. In juvenile means, let me back up. In the juvenile world, the word is adjudication. In the adult world, that same word would be trial. So this is the stuff that happens before adjudication. So the juvenile is brought to the attention of the government somehow. The police report is then given to the probation officer. A probation officer reads the police report and decides how to handle it. They might warn the minor, M-I-N-O-R, not like minor, but we used to call them the minor. I think they call them something else now. They might send it to a drug court program. They might give it to some other outside agency. They might divert the case so that the young person has the opportunity to handle this informally without any court action, or they could send it to the DA's office for filing, or they could send it to the adult system. A delinquency petition is filed if the case is handled formally. So when the DA's office gets the police report and decides that there's sufficient evidence to go forward, they will file what's called a delinquency petition. Juvenile diversion is similar to diversion in the adult system. And if you think diversion, just think of the word diversion in general. If you're thinking of something being a diversion, it's catching your attention and it's pulling you a different way. It's pulling you off your path. So imagine something pulling you off the path away from the juvenile delinquency system. That's what juvenile diversion is. It's giving you an opportunity to correct your mistakes without sending you through the juvenile justice system, without making you a formal juvenile delinquent. So that's an opportunity to take care of business, make up for what you've done, and get it dismissed and sealed like it never happened. So these are some other things: crisis intervention, all kinds of other stuff might happen at intake. But the juvenile might also be detained and held in custody at a juvenile justice facility. A juvenile may be detained by the police for up to 24 hours. If a juvenile is in custody, they must not be in sight or sound must not be, they cannot be, they have to be separated from all adults who are in custody by sight and sound. Okay, this does not mean that they can't be around an adult correctional worker. This just means that if you are in a facility that houses adults and juveniles, the juvenile cannot see or hear any other adult criminals. Does that make sense? Okay. Adjudication is just like a trial. Juveniles do have rights in the courts. They may not have all the same rights. They have most of the same rights as adults. But In re Gault was that first hearing that basically got juveniles due process. Excuse me. It used to be that juveniles didn't even have due process rights, that basically the judge and the attorneys would ultimately decide what was best for the juvenile without even finding out if the juvenile was guilty of the crime. They didn't even really care if the juvenile had committed the crime. They would just look at the case, look at the juvenile, and decide what they thought was best for the kid, even if they didn't know if the kid committed the crime or not. Make sense? It was kind of a disaster. So that's why In re Gault came about, giving juveniles rights, which was pretty significant. So they do have the right to notice of charges, right to counsel, cross-examine, privilege against self-incrimination. Some of you may have had youth courts at your high schools. The high schools throughout the Central Valley have them. We had it at Hoover. Most of the local schools have them. And these are basically a judge would come out to the school, a real judge would come out to the school, and volunteer students would serve as jurors, and we would ask an offender from the school who committed a low-level offense like a fight or, stealing a backpack or whatever, a first-time low-level offender, basically tell them you can participate in youth court and allow these jurors who are your fellow students to act as your jury. And if you comply with the orders that they come, with whatever terms that they come up with, and you don't get arrested again, and you go to school and take care of business over the next month or two, your case will get dismissed as if it never happened. I loved youth court. I can't say it was all that effective, but it was interesting to participate in. Disposition is sentencing. Juveniles, sentencing for juveniles is different than for adults because juveniles, again, their sentence is usually significantly less than what an adult would encounter. And there are some legal cases. It is unconstitutional to execute a juvenile who committed their crime before they were the age of 18. So if the day before my 18th birthday, I went out and murdered 50 people, I would not be eligible for the death penalty. And then in this one, in 2010, juveniles may not be sentenced to life without parole for a non-homicidal offense because it's cruel and unusual punishment. And then you'll see in 2012, life without parole is cruel and unusual for any homicide committed by anyone under 18. So this kind of gave us the first step, and then this one said basically anyone who was under 18 at the time they committed their offense would be ineligible for life without parole. So no matter what the offense is, the option for a release on parole has to be something that is considered for someone who was a juvenile at the time they committed their offense, even if it was a homicide. Now, does that mean that they all have to be paroled? No, it does not mean that. It means that they have to at least consider it, okay? So there are other options for sentencing for juveniles. In California, a lot of the juveniles are sentenced to custody time in juvenile halls. We, as of today, as of right now, still have what we used to call the California Youth Authority, and we now call that California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation Division of Juvenile Justice. So that is CDCR-DJJ. I don't know how long we will have that. Governor Newsom is trying to, at this point, I believe, close that down and send all of those offenders back to their county of origin. Some offenders are placed in group homes. We used to have a boot camp type program here in Fresno County as well for youth. That closed also during the financial downturn, recession in, I think it was 2008 or 2009. We have group homes. We have a lot of group homes. You'll see that here. We have a group home. I have a lot of them near Hoover High School, probably in your neighborhood that you have no idea about. Fun fact, the group home near Hoover High School was what they called a level 14 group home, meaning they had offenders there with very high needs. So they could charge up to $9,500 per offender per month at that group home, which I thought was interesting since the offenders all went to school all day. But anyways, so there's a lot of different places, residential and otherwise. Wilderness challenge programs. These were kind of similar to boot camp programs. I'm not familiar of a lot of these left in California. They do have the Valley Teen Ranch, but I don't think this is exactly the same as that. That's more like a group home program now. Excuse me. And then, yeah, group homes. There's lots of these. Family therapy is really common because a lot of times, as you can imagine, young people and their families, there's lots of issues that cause young people to end up committing offenses. So there's functional family therapy and multi-systemic therapy. So we use this a lot in Fresno County. Juvenile probation, there's a bunch of, different types of probation. I did this one, was basically, I supervised informal and formal probation. Lots and lots and lots of cases, lots and lots. At one point, I had almost 200 juveniles on my caseload, which is a small number compared to the adult world. Yeah, this is juvenile probation. Ooh. Oh, I'm going backwards now. Conditions of probation for adults, very similar to with the juveniles. Designed to control and rehabilitate. This is my very favorite here. Jacobs calls juvenile probation officers modern-day superheroes. That's me right there. You know it. Anyways. Gender-specific services for girls. So it's really tough. I will say, and have said many times, I would rather supervise 20 boys than 5 girls. Because the girls, this right in here, there was so much going on with the girls. They had so much trauma. They'd suffered so much trauma and victimization that they were just difficult to supervise. They had a lot of needs. So we have very limited services for girls. So it's very difficult and very different. Of course, you have intensive supervision probation, school-based probation. Yeah, I was able to see my clients fairly frequently because they were on my campus. Parole, juvenile parole aftercare. This is for people that are released from CDCR DJJ. I don't know where that will lead. Parole in California, juvenile parole, if we close CDCR DJJ, but we'll see. So parole agents, and we call them parole agents, do very similar, juvenile ones do very similar work to adult parole agents, which is very similar to what probation officers do. And this is a lot of what they do. A lot of report writing, I promise you that. Between 1/3 and up to 1/2 will commit new offenses while on supervision. Pretty depressing. It is very depressing. We do revoke their probation and parole. It does happen. It continues to happen, and all you can do is your best. The future, who knows? I don't know what's going to happen, certainly in California. And that's it. It's a long one. Sorry, guys.